Hello, you can see that they gave me a nice title. I mean, what can I not talk about if I'm given this? So I decided to emphasize the first two. We can probably all remember times when the world economy seemed reasonably balanced and most countries were not too troubled. But these seem to be difficult times. I must say that's not quite so obvious if you just sit in Hong Kong and look at the cranes working away and visit China and see the traffic congestion and pollution, all these wonderful signs of a vigorous economy. And that's where I live. I thought I'd start by just trying to talk a little bit about the whole world. In the world we're in, first thing I want to emphasize is that the capital that you find in any particular country is certainly not the result simply of that country's saving. I mean of the saving of its nationals or residents, whichever definition you prefer. I'm not going to get into problems of definition, but we have to emphasize what could be a very big difference. If you were looking at these issues from within a particular country or within a particular province or state or county, it would never occur to you to think that the amount of capital investment in one particular village should be exactly the same as the amount of savings that would be done by people in that village. You take it for granted that there are going to be plenty of reasons why people will want to locate their savings somewhere else than where they're currently living. There are very good reasons to do that, because you'll be talking about portfolios this morning, and it makes a lot of sense to try to reduce risk in your portfolio by spreading the location of the real assets that essentially contained within your portfolio. So of course we don't expect within a country that people will concentrate their savings on assets that represent fixed, real capital investment within their own locality. And once this is said and you look at things at an international level, then there doesn't seem to be any particular reason other than perhaps exchange regulations why there should be any close association between capital investment within the nation and saving within the nation. And I think it's kind of important, that's why I'm emphasizing it. It was interesting that Chris Pisarades this morning did say that let us suppose for a moment that investment and saving are the same in countries. And of course he had very good reasons for saying that, because if you look at data country by country, the difference between saving and investment is not always that high. I actually had occasion to look at the Chinese data on this recently. That's the other week. And I looked at the last 5 years for which I had data. It turned out that investment was a bit below 50% of GDP, and consumption was quite a bit below 50% of GDP. So that saving was bigger than investment, and now I've already forgotten the exact figure, but it was around 6% of GDP, the difference between the two. Now, 6% is maybe not a terribly high proportion of 50%, But that's really a big number and has an impact on the rest of the world. Bear that in mind, that I'm pretty sure that looking into the future, we're going to see much bigger differences than that. My next remark is based on a fair bit of theorizing and thinking about how things ought to be. But pretty much whatever criterion you use, whatever way you want to judge economic policies, you'd have to say that capital ought to go where the returns to capital are greatest. Of course, you've got to adjust for risk. So in some sense, these returns ought to be adjusted for risk. But a lot of the risk that motivates individual or indeed company investors is something like default risk, which is, in a curious sense, not a real economic risk, not really a risk that the investment will not actually produce the goods, but it is a risk that gets created because of the nature of the financial and ownership structures under which we operate. But although that could argue that maybe the adjustment for risk needn't be all that great, you can see that probably in the real world the distribution of capital is not all that close to a world in which the returns are pretty much the same everywhere. And if they were, then of course that's why I'm saying there is no reason why investment and saving should be the same in any particular country. Because this criterion for where the capital ought to be bears no relation at all to how much saving people would choose to do in any particular country. Now, of course, it would turn out that capital importers, that's to say countries that have, what are the ones that would import capital? The ones that are low savers. America always comes to mind. I completely agree with Chris's remark this morning that the reason why saving looks so low for a long period in the United States must be because so much of income is in capital gains of one kind and another and simply doesn't get measured. And that's part of saving as well as income. So we get a somewhat misleading impression of the situation in America. But countries vary. In the lower saving countries, if they have high or secure profits, should be capital importers. And they'll have balance of payments deficits. Simply follows straightforwardly what I suppose most people think of as imbalances within the world economy. And equally, of course, countries that export capital are going to have balance of payment surpluses. What should they be? Countries that do a lot of saving and have rather low profitability on the margin on investment, or perhaps where the risks for investment are pretty high, or perhaps the risk of investing may be pretty high because of default risk. I'm going to talk just for a little bit about this economic concept of optimal saving and investment. I've talked in effect about optimal investment because you see the question of where the investment ought to go doesn't turn on interesting economic questions like how you would measure the welfare of people in different countries or the same person at different times. But if you're going to start thinking about saving, then you're going to be thinking about consumption. So you really should be asking the question, how much consumption should a particular country be doing this year compared to next year, the year after, and the long run? That's the question of what optimal saving would be. Since, of course, if you do less consumption, you've got more of your income left over to pass on to your future self or to future generations, and to use for consumption in the future. And I think it's perfectly fair to discuss the question whether countries have these decisions right. I'm not saying that the countries ought to do what I say, not at all. I just think that it's something you could reasonably ask countries to think about. Because, of course, again, this was remarked on this morning, the actual saving in different countries is not just the result of individuals deciding how much of their income they will save and how much they will consume. It also is connected with how much the public sector saves and how much it spends. Now, once countries have the decisions right, the rate of return ought, as I said, risk adjusted to be the same everywhere. But what about per capita consumption? Sorry, there's a dreadful typo on this page. It should be per capita without an L. Consumption per head should grow at a rate that is a fixed fraction of the rate of return on capital. Actually, the very simple way of putting this is to say that how fast per capita consumption in a country should grow should be proportional to the interest rate, the world interest rate. Now, I'm not saying it should be the same proportion in different countries. What I'm really wanting to say is that this ought to reflect how people in that particular country would generally compare the advantages of consuming today with the advantages of consuming in the future, for example, in their retirement or later in their lives, which is something we're discussing this morning. And it's plausible that you wouldn't have big differences between different countries if people were really able to take these decisions straightforwardly. But that's why I say that this fraction of proportionality between the rate of growth of consumption per head on the one hand and the world interest rate on the other could vary from country to country, but should only vary on the basis of different tastes for whether you'd like to consume more sooner or later. Now, it's understandable that perhaps people in America might have a preference for early consumption, and people in China might have a preference for later consumption, and that might be an explanation of why you get more saving in China, but it's hard to believe that that could actually explain the very big difference between essentially zero rate of growth of consumption per head for most people in the United States and 7 to 8% growth of consumption per head for people in China. You can see that there's a big gap there. Well, on the basis of that argument, what would you expect to see if somehow countries had come to judiciously right decisions? You'd expect low-wage countries, and see, the reason I say low-wage to skill is what I have in mind is that if only we could measure it, there should be a wage for identical worker hours. By identical, I mean that they have the same working ability in some sense. Now, I know that labour is very heterogeneous, and we really can't answer that question. But it's very important to realise that you can't just compare the wage level in different countries, like America and China, and say, oh, America is clearly a high-wage country compared to China. And you have, in some sense, you have to adjust for the abilities and learning and experience, and I mean social as well as individual experience, of workers in the two countries. Still leave you with a pretty high ratio, American wages to Chinese. Well, you'd expect the low-wage ones to have most of the capital relative to output, because you'd expect the rate of return to capital would be higher. in countries that have a low wage, at least provided they can use the same technology. Now, of course, what kind of technology you can use depends very much on the skills of your workers, of the labour force. You may not be able to use the sort of technologies that produce large memory chips if you don't have well-educated and one might say well-behaved workers. But of course, relatively lower wage countries like Korea may actually be better at this kind of thing than high wage countries like the United States. So you'd expect the ones with the low wage to have more capital, and the ones with the high wage to have less. A low exchange rate, of course, lowers wages. So it's one of the ways that countries may be able to change the position of their wages relative to the world. On that basis, you would think that China should import capital, unless its citizens want remarkably rapidly growing consumption, individually, that's to say, which is really not plausible that they do. And the USA should be exporting capital, unless its citizens somehow prefer very slow growing consumption. And of course, this is not what we see. Things are quite the other way around. Of course, there's no reason why the USA should complain about this, so long as it's a capital importer. In fact, it was its choice in some sense. And it does mean that the income of the country is bigger than its product, its output, because it's getting effectively interest on the other way around. So it might have some complaint, I would have to agree. But they have been complaining a lot, and on the face of it, a lower exchange rate would be of advantage to China more than it would be to the United States. Countries where capital investment is high relative to output, of course, grow faster, generally. There's a certain amount, in fact, rather a lot of uncertainty associated with capital investment and its consequences. But the point of capital investment is to produce output. And if there's more investment, there's going to be a faster rate of growth. It's true that under certain assumptions that in the long run, a higher investment wouldn't generate a higher growth rate. But we don't live in the long run, and we never will. Of course, also later startups have a particular advantage, and I'm obviously including China in that. There's a time progression in countries as they manage to join the whole process of economic growth. And we've had a very exciting time as far as that goes in the last 50, 60 years. As first Japan got in there, then other East Asian countries got in. Then some of the South American countries started doing it. And China, of course, particularly notably. But Japan set the model. And although other countries have sometimes had rather higher growth rates, China is not outstandingly special in the growth rate. A 10% growth rate seems to be perfectly normal for countries. Well, the world economy goes on like this, and goes on fine, whether it follows what I described as an optimal distribution of capital around the world. That all does fine, so long as this demand for real investment happens to match, along with consumption demand, full employment output. Keynes, of course, famously pointed out that it was very hard to see why there should be any guarantee that, looking at any particular country, that the demand for investment taken along with the demand for consumption generated by output should actually equal full employment output. and therefore investment demand could well be deficient, and as a result there could be serious unemployment of resources, particularly labour. But we have had long periods in the world economy where most countries were quite fully employed, or can properly be interpreted that way. So we've got to somehow explain how that can be so, and then we can get other episodes, which fortunately have tended to be a little shorter, in which the unemployment levels are quite high. But you see this difficulty with investment spread all over the world. It's hard to see what mechanism there might be to ensure that investment demand is sufficient to maintain full employment. In principle, to get this right, interest rates have to be right. They have to be low enough to encourage the right level of investment. And interest rates are essentially determined by lots of different governments. And furthermore, they're determined by the relationship between governments and the financial system. And we've recently seen a dreadful breakdown of this relationship, which leads to effectively much too low an interest rate in the relevant sense. That's to say, the interest rate goes very low, but the investment rate is still too low, even at essentially a zero or negative cost of capital. But actually the true cost of capital seems to be very high, and I think that's the real problem. So everything goes fine, so long as investment is high enough, or maybe even higher. If it were even higher, then you have to rely on governments controlling demand sufficiently to prevent inflation from running away. And that they seem to have been quite successful. There have been a few high inflation episodes in particular countries, but they've been contained. But then events reduced demand too quickly for governments to compensate, and now we live in such an episode. Now there are two things I want to identify as the source of the demand deficiency. One is the credit squeeze, which I think everybody is very aware of, and so people tend to talk about the situation as a credit problem. No question this is very important, and indeed the failure of most countries to tackle the credit rationing problem seems to me to have a lot to do with the continuation of the recession. If savers and financial intermediaries suffer capital loss, then of course they change their portfolio choices and they want to lend safely, which generally seems to mean not real investments, because particular real investments, lending to businesses and so on, seems to be individually quite risky, even if you've got a lot of averaging. But they like to lend to governments. Well, that may turn out to have been a bit of a mistake, but that was what they were doing. And obviously sometimes other kinds of assets, like land, although that's become very risky of late, and gold and wine, and you can add to the list. Things where investing in them can certainly increase their value, but does nothing to get real investment done. But there is another, I believe, another quite serious contribution to the recession. I think the reason why it's as much of a problem as it is because there is the second element as well. And indeed, I think it was the second element that got it started. And that's what I will call income inequality, although I'm not thinking of it in quite the way that most people do. Because I think of income inequality being created by an oil price boom, or by a lot of gambling, swaps, of which, of course, there are trillions outstanding and imputed value on world markets. swaps are essentially gambles between two parties who have different beliefs about what is going to happen. So that's why it's appropriate to call them gambles. And one of them is going to be right and the other is going to be wrong. Many of these derivatives and swaps are so written that that can create very considerable losses for one side and very considerable gains for the other. And of course, what that does is to create inequality. Obviously, insofar as they truly hedge against genuine risks, that's not true. It reduces inequality. But the sheer volume of the trade seems to make it very clear that what we've had because of the derivative markets is probably a very great increase in inequality. But let's look at the oil price boom issue. The problem is that when oil prices go up a lot, and of course you all know that every time we've had a big increase in oil prices, we've had a serious recession in the world economy. So you have to say, well, why would that be true? People have some tendency, although I think American government has avoided this view, some tendency to think that rising prices are associated with inflation. So that this is a situation in which governments should adopt fairly restrictive policies in terms of their fiscal balance. But what does it mean? It means people have to pay more for something that's in relatively inelastic demand. Really quite inelastic demand, because it's a derived demand. And that means that people have less money to spend on other things. So people spend less in real terms. Of course, it involves income to the owners of the oil reserves, but then you have to ask yourselves whether you think that when the owners of oil get a big increase in their income, whether they turn that into real spending of the kind that the real economy needs. And I think the answer is very evidently that they do not. So if the oil states in Russia and so on get big increases in income, or oil owners get it, this doesn't help the world economy, quite the contrary. And you would expect that booms of that kind will indeed cause problems. Much bigger problems would be caused by changes in land prices, although there might be a similar element there. But in that case, we don't have quite the same inelasticity of demand. The problem is, you see, that rising commodity prices reduce real demand. Well, when these two things go together, when people go to the bank and are told they've got to pay 10% and they can't borrow as much as they want because the bank is feeling very nervous about its portfolio. And in any case, on the consumption side, people are generally spending much less because the richer of them have done rather well but see no need to consume. Then the world economy is in a problem. Can I just digress for a moment? I won't take long over this, but I was struck when a few years ago we got into this oil price boom, and our Prime Minister at the time, Gordon Brown, said, this is terrible, we need to get the oil prices down. But this was just after he had greatly approved of a report on global warming that says it's very important to have high oil prices, amongst other things, in order to reduce demand for carbon burning. I think he was right on both points, but it certainly sounded wildly inconsistent, and I'm not sure if he understood in what sense it was right. To encourage non-carbon technologies and reduce demand for carbon-produced energy, the price to users should be high. But to redistribute income from oil owners to others, the price to oil producers should be low. So we ought to have a world in which most of the oil produced comes from the Middle East, where it's very cheap and they don't get very much, and Britain and Norway and probably Russia. and certainly the United States, would find that they couldn't get anything for oil that would make it worthwhile. Well, no wonder you get a lot of resistance to these measures in the richer oil-owning countries. But that's the way it should be. And of course, what that means is a tax. And probably we should be thinking about that in other areas as well. So when I talk in terms of the impact of a particular high price, it's important to distinguish between the producer price and the consumer price. And what I'm saying in this case is that it's regrettable that the consumer, that the producer price became so high because it generated incomes. And I'm not arguing that measures should be taken to reduce the price to consumers. Well, what can be done about this? As the press has already discovered, a wild Keynesian in these matters. And it seems to me that the only thing that can deal with the serious problem of high unemployment and the semi-serious problem of low economic growth is fiscal expansion. Not quite the only thing, because insofar as fiscal expansion took the form of something to expand investment, the United States has done something of that by the government actually making loans. And probably there should be much more of that, and one would like to have seen something like that happening in Europe as well. So I would add that to fiscal expansion as an important part of the policy mix that's needed. But it does seem to me that observing China, the big stimulus package there, which really was pretty big by world standards, must be the real explanation as to why China very quickly restored its version of full employment. I mean, it gets recorded in the back of The Economist every week as around 10%, which sounds pretty high, although not perhaps in Greece or Spain. But 10% would be high. On the other hand, it's not clear that things are adequately measured. And that's not the government's official figure, which is much lower. Well, government spending seemed to work. There you are, China restored very quickly, despite the fact that they had a very big downturn in exports. And now we're seeing again that exports aren't doing so well, but this doesn't seem to be hitting the economy. So I think we can credit government spending. But of course, particularly in Italy and some other economies, you recognise the difficulty of raising government spending. Perhaps there isn't enough government spending in the developed economies. Yeah, I think that's very plausible. And surely it wasn't soon enough. And the political problems that gave rise to that are something that needs serious examination for the future. Although it's very hard to imagine how America could make the appropriate constitutional changes to ensure that it would be possible to adopt expansionary policies much faster. Because if they're not very soon, they're likely to have to go on for a long time, and they're likely to be much less effective, which is a serious problem. Of course, there is a standard claim by some economists that public spending would be fully offset by private saving. Why? Because people know that they will have to pay for that public spending later. It's actually not even quite clear that that's right, but I think I'll have time to come to that. But it just isn't plausible that you would get anything approaching a full offset there. But there is a problem of that kind. Spending financed by debt means that later the government is going to want to reduce its contribution to net demand so as to reduce the national debt. So even if that's not completely necessary, you can certainly expect that the government will do that. So in some sense, doing more spending now makes it more difficult to do more spending when it's needed later. That, of course, would not necessarily be a reason for doing it. There is a standard problem in economics, which is what is the right way to cut a cake for an infinitely lived individual? How much should you eat today and how much in the future? Assuming that the individual isn't so irrational as to want to discount future consumption value, then of course the answer is there is no answer. You never consume any cake, and at the end of time you're left with an uneaten cake. This is obviously nonsense. I think in a way that's where the world has got to now. That it's saying, no more we can do by way of stimulus, because if we do, country deficits will get even worse, national debts will build up. Why is that a problem? Mainly because in the future you will be closer to the point where the cost of borrowing becomes incredibly high, as it now is for Greece. There's no guarantee that in time a primary surplus sufficient to eliminate debt would actually be consistent with full employment. That was certainly a problem that worried Keynes. But since we're living in the shorter run, we don't quite need to sort that problem out now. But one way of getting around it is monetary expansion. That's what quantitative easing is for. And I think Europe should really be using monetary expansion more and not be frightened by it. But I find it inconceivable to think of the German politicians not being frightened by monetary expansion because of the history of hyperinflation in Weimar. Is it possible for national debt to grow forever? Well, a growing economy can indeed sustain a growing national debt, but only if the interest rate is less than the growth rate. And of course that sounds pretty absurd and undesirable. Why would the interest rate be less than the growth rate? But historically, of course, that has tended to be true on average for quite long periods. One reason, certainly, why Britain's national debt is not terribly high is exactly because the interest rate that the government was paying on the debt was less than the growth rate for quite long periods. Quite a lot less, in fact. We're talking of real comparisons, of course. It's the real interest rate. Japan's a striking example where indeed the debt grew very large, domestically financed, of course, but that shows that you can get up to a significant multiple of the GDP without that in itself being a problem. That's to say, people would be willing to lend to Japan at quite a modest interest rate. Economic management is hard when interest rates for the debt become high, of course, as in what I'll call the problem Euro states. What is the problem then? Occasional large deficits should be manageable. That shouldn't be an issue. The problem is global balance. The problem for the world economy is when nations that could do expansionary spending don't. There are many countries now that clearly cannot do that. If Greece were to default, it would not be able to diminish its austerity program. It would actually have to increase it. Similar problems with other countries. But not to say that default may not have its advantages, but it wouldn't have that particular advantage. So some countries ought to adopt expansionary policies. The problem is, of course, that the advantages of the expansionary policies may be very largely for other countries, not for themselves, or for other countries' workers or non-workers, not for themselves. And China is an example. And this may take you back to my initial claim that China should be a capital importer. The USA should be a capital exporter. And that the world really should look different from what it does. Because part of the move towards China being a capital importer would be that China should be adopting expansionary policies. In other words, even now, when China is very worried about domestic inflation, it seems plausible to say that China is a classically underemployed economy where it would be entirely possible to expand more. So it's nice that they're prepared to do something for Europe, but what we're talking about should be trillions, not billions. And that's a very big difference. Inflation, of course, is a concern, even when price rises are really relative price adjustments, as I think they are in the case of most of the rising prices, food prices, oil prices, commodity prices. Relative price adjustments for things like that have to mean a rise in the average price level, because the other prices are not going to, well, some of them fall, but wages are not going to. Commodity and food prices, I think, have that character. Just finish off with some remarks about China, because I think it may prove to be an interestingly different example of the problem, without having any explicit national debt problem. That's to say, I agree there is a problem with these expansionary policies. In China, banks were made to lend, which I was saying is exactly what you want to happen all over the world, and didn't happen. And they were made to lend, of course, particularly to state-owned enterprises, because the kinds of investments were infrastructure investments. Railways is the one that certainly gets mentioned a great deal in the local press and probably throughout the rest of the world. As a result, many of the loans made are likely to be non-performing. And indeed, if I go to a press conference in China, almost the first thing that the journalists are likely to ask about is the risks of bad debts as a result of the big expansion of investments. State-owned banks will presumably have deficits. At least they will if they properly evaluate their debts. And the last round of these problems, various devices were used to avoid measuring that way, and that's what will happen again. The deficits will effectively be backed by government, but they won't be converted into full bailouts. And I believe that this alternative way of doing it, which can be done with state-owned enterprises, although it does have disadvantages of soft budget constraints, has the advantage that it's not likely that the individual executives and managers and bankers within the bank will get the excessively large incomes that they in fact secured in the course of the West's bailouts. So there'll be a sort of gradual bailout, as small as possible, which I believe won't generate the excessive incomes which have themselves a depressive effect. We do have a very interesting looking world, because if you just concentrate on the real economy, I mean what people are making and doing, then a lot of the world is doing rather well. It's China, it's India, it's a lot of South America, the Turkic lands, I mean not only Turkey, but there are places like Kazakhstan and so on, which share culture and language. They're doing well. They had the advantage of nice, simple financial systems. Didn't get mesmerized by securitization and the notion that they were insuring when they weren't. Hedging, complex derivatives, clever short selling are something that they haven't yet suffered from, although some of them have an ambition to get involved. So there wasn't any credit crisis. Investment wasn't hit. Businesses could still borrow. These countries then easily compensated for reduced exports to the developed economies in ways that were totally unexpected. But it is true in China that inequality is apparently growing. And if I'm right, that inequality is the other part of the problem, there may be something building up, but I suspect that is for the long run. Thank you very much.